The climb has been steep and the path dangerous, but the final ascension is finally within your grasp at the peak. Stay with us as we reach the summit of the story and reveal the ultimate truth. Hit subscribe now and witness the most important ending today.
My daughter set her fork down very quietly in the middle of dinner. Not the way you set a fork down when you're finished eating. The way you set it down when your hands need to do something and you don't know what yet. Then she looked at me just for a second, and she pressed 2 fingers against the tablecloth. I felt it more than I saw it. We hadn't used that signal in 11 years. My name is Paul Whitmore. I'm 58 years old. I spent 24 years as a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Chicago field office, working wire fraud, Ponzi schemes, and elder financial exploitation before I took early retirement at 52 and moved back to Duluth, Minnesota, where I grew up. I consult now for a regional credit union and occasionally for the Minnesota Department of Commerce when they need someone to sit across from a document and tell them what it's actually saying. My daughter's name is Haley. She's 33. She works as a physical therapist at a clinic in St. Paul and has more practical intelligence than anyone I've ever met in a room with a graduate degree. She's also the person who, when she was 22 and going through her first bad breakup, asked me if we could have a signal. Something quiet that meant I need you to help me get out of this conversation without making a scene. We were at her college graduation dinner, and her ex-boyfriend had shown up with his parents and seated himself 3 tables away and kept finding reasons to walk past us. She'd pressed 2 fingers against the tablecloth and looked at me, and I'd understood immediately. I stood up and said I needed some air and asked her to walk with me, and we'd been out the door before his next lap. That was her thing. 2 fingers on a flat surface meant I need you. I need you right now, quietly, without making it obvious. She used it that night in February, a Saturday, the kind of cold Minnesota evening where the windows are fogged at the edges and the whole house smells like the pot roast my wife Beverly has been making every February since 1994. We were sitting at the dining room table, the 4 of us, me, Beverly, Haley, and the man she'd been dating for 5 months. His name was Cole Whitfield. He was 38, trim, well-spoken, with the kind of easy confidence that some men develop and some men rehearse. He worked in private equity, he explained, specifically in what he called alternative asset facilitation, helping individual investors access opportunities that institutional barriers typically kept out of reach. He said it the way you say something you've said many times before. He was telling me about a property fund he'd helped structure. Residential development parcels in Central Florida, he said, outside of Orlando, in a growth corridor where land appreciation was averaging 14 to 18% annually. His clients had been very happy. It was the kind of return you couldn't get sitting in a mutual fund, he said, and he smiled at me when he said it. The way you smile at someone you've already decided isn't a threat. I smiled back. Beverly asked him how he'd gotten into that line of work, and he told a smooth story about working at a brokerage in his 20s and deciding the traditional model wasn't serving clients the way it should. He was pleasant. He asked Beverly about her garden. He remembered that I liked my coffee black because Haley had mentioned it once, and he made a small thing of it, easy and warm. He was very good at being in a room. Haley pressed 2 fingers against the tablecloth. I didn't change my expression. I asked Cole about the regulatory structure of the funds he worked with, and he said the alternative investment space had less overhead than traditional markets, which was actually part of the value proposition. Less regulatory drag meant capital moved faster. I said that was interesting and reached for my coffee. Beverly looked at me the way she has looked at me for 31 years when she knows I'm working something through and trying not to show it on my face. She stood up and asked Cole if he'd like to see the photos from our trip to the Boundary Waters last summer, and she walked him toward the living room, talking easily about loons and canoes. Haley stayed at the table. She waited until they were out of earshot. Then she put both hands flat on the table and looked at me with the expression she had at 13 when she'd broken my reading glasses and needed to tell me. "Dad," she said, "I think he's been talking to me about my 401k. "Tell me what's been happening," I said. "He's been saying," she looked at the table, "he's been saying I'm not maximizing my retirement position, that the market's going to correct and I'm overexposed to index funds. He has a fund he says performs independently of market conditions. He calls it a market-neutral alternative vehicle. How long has he been building up to this?" She rubbed her thumb along the edge of her placemat. "A few weeks. He emailed me a prospectus last month." Something called Meridian Capital Partners. It had performance charts and a Chicago address and everything looked normal. But something, she paused, something felt off about the way he talked about it. Like it was rehearsed, like he'd made the speech before. I kept my voice level. How much is in your 401k? She met my eyes. A little over 90,000. I sat with that for a moment. That was 11 years of working and saving and passing on things she wanted so she could have something solid later. $90,000 that a 38-year-old man with a good smile had been quietly positioning himself to access. Has he asked you to sign anything? I said. Not yet. He said the next investment window opens March 1st. He said if I wanted to get in on the early allocation, I'd need to commit by the end of February. He made it sound casual, like he was doing me a favor by mentioning it. Artificial urgency. That's what we called it. The closing window. The limited seats. The favor someone's doing you by letting you in before the door shuts. Legitimate funds do not have 3-week commitment deadlines. Does he know what I did? I said. She shook her head. I told him you worked for the federal government. He said that must have been a good, stable career. Stable, I said. That was the word he used. Yes. That told me something. Either he hadn't looked me up, which seemed careless, or he had and wasn't worried, which seemed worse. Overconfidence in operators like this usually meant one of two things. They'd gotten away with it enough times that they'd stopped being careful, or they had an exit prepared and they weren't concerned about loose ends. Forward me that prospectus tonight, I said, before he leaves. Dad. I kept my voice quiet. I'm not telling you what to do with your life. I'm asking to look at a document. That's it. She nodded. Beverly came back in with coal and he helped clear the plates without being asked, and told a good story about a fishing trip in Montana that I actually would have enjoyed hearing under different circumstances. He had a handshake at the door that was firm without being performative, and he said it had been great to finally meet me and that he hoped we'd do it again soon. Beverly waited until the sound of his car had faded down the street. Then she stood at the kitchen sink and didn't say anything for a while. You saw it, I said. I saw you go very still when he said regulatory drag, she said, the same way you went still in 2009 when that man at the neighborhood association meeting started talking about his investment club. I need to make some calls tomorrow, I said. Beverly dried her hands. How bad do you think it is? I don't know yet, I said. But our daughter has $90,000 in a 401k and a boyfriend who moved the conversation there within 5 months and is pushing a March 1st deadline. Beverly set the dish towel down on the counter with a kind of controlled precision. Okay, she said. What do you need from me? 31 years. You learn to name the weight of something without having to trace every edge of it. The prospectus Haley forwarded me that night was 14 pages. It was formatted cleanly, professionally typeset, watermarked letterhead from Meridian Capital Partners, LLC, with a registered address on North Wacker Drive in Chicago. There was a disclosure section in the back written in dense financial language designed to look thorough and be skimmed. I didn't skim it. I spent 2.5 hours at the kitchen table after Beverly went to bed. The performance charts showed 7 years of returns with no third-party auditor cited anywhere in the document. The fund's strategy described a market-neutral long-short equity approach with alternative asset overlays, which is language that can mean whatever you need it to mean in the moment. The investor assurance section referenced the document called the Meridian Capital Investor Protection Addendum, which was listed as a separate attachment. No attachment was included. The minimum investment was $20,000. There was a preferred allocation tier for commitments over $50,000. I pulled the North Wacker Drive address. It was a registered agent service, the kind of office you can rent for $80 a month to receive mail and list as your business location. Not a real office, not a real firm. I knew who to call. The first was a woman named Sandra Foss, who had run securities fraud investigations for the SEC Chicago Regional Office for 16 years before she moved to the CFTC. We'd worked parallel investigations twice, and she knew how I read a document. I texted her at 11 p.m. and she texted back in 4 minutes, which told me she was still up and still working. The second was a man named Victor Huang, who had spent 20 years as a forensic accountant for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois, and now ran his own consulting practice in Evanston. Victor could look at a financial instrument and tell you within 15 minutes what it was actually built to do. Sandra called me at 8:10 the next morning. I gave her Cole Whitfield's name, the fund name, the Chicago address. Give me an hour, she said, and hung up. Victor called at 8:40. I read him the fund strategy language and the investor protection section, and he interrupted me once to ask me to repeat the line about alternative asset overlays. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Paul," he said, "there's no underlying asset described anywhere in this document. Not once. A legitimate long-short equity fund would have at minimum a general description of asset classes, position limits, risk parameters. This has none of that. The market-neutral language is decoration. It's there so that when the fund loses money, they can say it was market conditions. But there's no actual strategy here. There's no engine. It's a shell with a nice paint job. If someone invested and the fund reported losses, there would be nothing to verify, no positions to audit, no assets to trace. The money goes in and the documentation is engineered so that every exit point looks legitimate on paper." Sandra called back at 10:20. Her voice had the particular flatness I recognized from case briefings when something was more complicated than expected. "He's real," she said. "Cole Whitfield, 38, grew up in Indianapolis, studied finance at Indiana University, worked 4 years at a legitimate broker-dealer in Nashville before leaving under circumstances the firm documented but didn't publicize. The firm filed a Form U-5 with FinRe. The U-5 listed the reason for termination as conduct inconsistent with firm standards. I pulled the underlying complaint. He had directed 2 clients toward an outside investment vehicle without firm approval. One of the clients was a divorced woman, 54 years old. She transferred $62,000 before the firm caught it. Was there a criminal referral, I said. The client declined to cooperate. Sandra paused. She'd been with him for 8 months. The relationship was personal, not just financial. She said she felt embarrassed, that it had been her decision and she didn't want anyone to know. I closed my eyes. There it was. 8 months, I said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. It's the same architecture, Paul. Longer runway, same destination. He refined it. The timeline's tighter now because he got impatient or because he needs money or because he's done it enough that he knows exactly how long the warm-up needs to be. Is Meridian registered anywhere? No. No registration in Illinois, Indiana, Florida, or federally. No ADV filing, no Form D, nothing. It does not legally exist. So he's running unregistered securities fraud. That's what it looks like. The question is whether we can document it before he disappears. These operators, Paul, you know how this goes. Clean digital footprint, minimal physical presence, the ability to become someone else in a different city in 72 hours. He's probably already running 2 or 3 of these simultaneously. How far along is he with Haley? Prospectus delivered. Deadline in 10 days. Sandra exhaled slowly. We need a recorded conversation. Her on audio making the full pitch, asking for a commitment, providing account details for the transfer. In Illinois, one-party consent. If Haley agrees to meet with him and records it herself, it's admissible. But Paul. She paused. She has to be willing to do this. She has to be the one who decides. She used our signal, I said. She was waiting for me to tell her what to do with it. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, call me when she's ready. I drove to St. Paul that afternoon. Haley met me at the door of her apartment in her running clothes, her hair still pulled back. She'd been anxious since that morning. I could see it in the way she was standing, her weight slightly forward, like she'd been waiting to move and didn't know which direction yet. I sat down on her couch and I told her everything. The registered agent address in Chicago. Victor's analysis of the fund document. The FinRe U-5 termination. The woman in Nashville who had been with him for 8 months and transferred $62,000 and was too embarrassed to say anything. Haley sat very still through all of it. Then she said, "He told me he was falling in love with me." She didn't say it with anger. She said it with the quiet of someone calculating the distance between what they believed and what was true. "I know," I said. "I know he said that." She looked at the window for a long time. When she looked back at me, her expression had shifted. Not hard, not brittle. Settled. The same expression she'd had at 19 when she decided to change her major and came home to tell me and had clearly already made the decision before she sat down. She looked like someone who was done with the part where she was confused. "What do I need to do?" she said. I explained the recording. I told her she would need to let him make the full pitch, let him describe the fund, let him ask for the commitment, let him name the account for the wire transfer. She couldn't rush him or tip him off. She needed to be a person who was seriously considering saying yes. "Can you do that?" I said. She looked at me with those direct gray eyes she's had since she was 2 years old and said, "I've been sitting with this for 6 weeks. I can sit across from him for 90 minutes. She texted him that evening and said she'd been thinking about the February deadline, and she had some questions she wanted to talk through in person. He wrote back within minutes. Warm, easy, said he was glad she was taking it seriously and suggested coffee Thursday morning at a place near her apartment. He said he'd bring a printed copy of the subscription documents in case she was ready to move forward. He brought the documents. Of course he brought them. Thursday morning I drove back to St. Paul and we sat at her kitchen table for an hour. I walked her through exactly what to do. Phone in her coat pocket. Voice memo running before he sat down. Let the silence work. If he slowed down, she shouldn't fill it. Ask clarifying questions in a flat, neutral tone, the kind that sounds like homework, not suspicion. If he named a number, let him say it twice. People who are running a script will always say the important numbers twice because they want them to land. She nodded through all of it. "How are you feeling?" I said. She thought about it honestly. "Like I want to get it done," she said, "and like I want to be the person who stopped him." "That's the right thing to feel," I said. "Stay in it." I drove home and Beverly made sandwiches and we sat at the kitchen table and didn't say much. She had the radio on, an old jazz station she's been listening to since the 90s, and we waited. Haley texted at 2047 p.m. "Got it. Calling you in 15. Her voice when she called was steady but compressed, the way a voice gets when the adrenaline hasn't fully left yet. She said he'd been thorough and unhurried. He described the fund structure with the ease of someone who had described it many times. He'd quoted returns of 16 to 21% annually. He'd explained the account for the wire transfer, a credit union in South Dakota, because the fund managers preferred working outside the major banks for processing speed, he said. He told her the money would be actively working within 48 hours of the transfer, and that the early allocation meant she'd get a preferred rate that later investors wouldn't have access to. He'd pushed the documents across the table and put a pen next to them. She'd said she needed a day to think. He'd said, of course, take your time, but gently reminded her that the window was closing. He'd covered her hand with his when he said it. I called Sandra that evening. She asked Haley to send the audio file through a secure file transfer, which took 20 minutes. Sandra listened to it overnight and called me at 7:15 the next morning. "It's more than enough," she said. "We have what we need. I won't describe in detail what happened after that because it wasn't mine to own. What I can tell you is that Cole Whitfield was arrested at his apartment in Chicago on a Monday morning. I know the day and the approximate time because Haley called me while she was sitting in her car in the parking lot of her clinic, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and said very quietly, 'Sandra just texted. It's done.' I said, 'Good.' I said, 'Good.' I said, 'Go inside and see your patients and we'll talk tonight.' She said, 'Okay.' Then she said, 'Dad, thank you.' The investigation that followed found that Cole had run variations of the same scheme in Tennessee and Ohio before Illinois. The South Dakota credit union account was one of 4 he'd used. Across verified victims, 9 people, the total losses were just over $800,000. Several of those victims had already transferred money before Haley ever met him. She was the first one who didn't lose a dollar. 6 weeks later, she came for Sunday dinner. Just the 3 of us. Beverly made pot roast. We sat at the same table where 4 months earlier, a man with a very good handshake had sat across from me and talked about alternative asset facilitation while my daughter pressed 2 fingers against the tablecloth. Haley was quieter than usual through dinner, not the tight, anxious quiet of the weeks before. Something looser. The quiet of a person who has been through something difficult and is on the other side of it and is still deciding what it means. She helped Beverly with the dishes, and then she came and sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee mug. The heat was running and the windows were dark, and the house had the particular stillness of a Sunday evening when the week hasn't started yet, and the day is winding down. "I keep thinking I should have known sooner," she said. "You knew when you needed to know," I said. She shook her head a little, the Nashville woman. He'd done this before and she trailed off. "She wasn't foolish," I said. I want you to understand that clearly. She wasn't naive, and you weren't naive, and the 9 people who lost money to him weren't foolish. I spent 24 years interviewing people who had been defrauded by some of the most capable, patient, and methodical operators I have ever seen work. A room, they were not looking for people who were unintelligent. They were looking for people who were unintelligent. They were looking for people who were open, people who were willing to hope for something good, people who were capable of trusting someone. Cole Whitfield spent 5 months building a relationship with you that had real warmth in it, real moments. The time was real, even if the intent behind it was not. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's him investing significant skill into making something feel genuine. The red flags, the unregistered fund, the urgency around the deadline, the address that wasn't a real address. Those things are often only visible from outside the relationship or in retrospect, which is why you used the signal. She was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about the pen, she said. He put the pen right next to the documents, like it was already decided. That's the pressure point, I said. The moment when the whole architecture comes together, the relationship, the urgency, the document, the pen. At that moment, most people don't say I should think about this. They say I don't want to disappoint him. And by then the thing he's built makes it very hard to separate those 2 sentences from each other. She looked at her coffee. How did you know? She said. In those 2 seconds at the table when I pressed my fingers. How did you know it wasn't just nothing? Because you invented that signal, I said. You made it for a specific reason. You don't use something like that for nothing. She smiled at that. Small and real. We sat there until Beverly came back in and the conversation moved to other things. Later we watched part of a movie that none of us were particularly invested in, and Beverly fell asleep on the couch, and Haley and I sat in the low light of the living room, not talking. The way you can sit with someone when there's nothing left that needs to be said. There are things I want to say clearly, as someone who spent more than 2 decades working financial fraud. The most effective financial predators in the country are not targeting people who are careless. They are targeting people who are emotionally available, who are open to connection, who are willing to believe that something good is happening. They are patient and they are methodical, and they invest real time in building something that feels genuine, because the feeling of genuineness is the instrument. By the time the investment conversation starts, the victim isn't just evaluating a financial product. They're evaluating whether they trust the person in front of them, and they've been carefully prepared to say yes. There are specific things to watch for. Any investment promising consistent annual returns above 8 or 9% warrants serious scrutiny. Any fund or advisor you cannot verify through FINRA's broker check database or the SEC's investment advisor public disclosure database is a significant warning sign. Both are free and take less than 5 minutes to search. If someone cannot show you a current Form 8V or CRD number, they are not a registered investment advisor, and they are not legally allowed to be managing your money. An urgency deadline around a commitment window is a manipulation tactic, not a business reality. A real fund does not need your money by the end of the month. In the United States, all investment advisors managing client funds must be registered either federally with the SEC or at the state level through your state securities regulator. You can verify any advisor or fund through FINRA BrokerCheck at brokercheck.finra.org. You can look up investment advisor registrations through the SEC's IAPD at advisorinfo.sec.gov. If the person asking you to invest cannot be found in either place, stop. In this, if someone in your life is reaching out to you, in whatever way they have, with whatever signal they've kept between the two of you, please listen to it. Haley had known something was wrong for 6 weeks before she pressed those 2 fingers against my tablecloth. Some part of her had already done the math. She used what we had because she needed someone outside the situation to look at what she was inside of. That instinct, the one that says something here is not right even when you can't explain it yet, is not paranoia. It is not oversensitivity. It is information. Protect it in the people you love and trust it in yourself. We did not lose anything except 5 months of believing someone was worth believing in. And the difference, in the end, was my daughter sitting at a dinner table on a cold February night and pressing 2 fingers against the tablecloth. If your gut is telling you something, it is not nothing. It never is. I've thought a lot about what actually saved Haley's $90,000. It wasn't my 24 years with the FBI. It wasn't Sandra's contacts or Victor's ability to read a financial document in 15 minutes. Those things mattered, But they weren't the beginning of it. The beginning was a 22-year-old woman at a graduation dinner who decided she needed a way to reach her father without making a scene, and a father who decided that signal was worth taking seriously every single time she used it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the fraud itself, not the investigation, not the arrest. The part where Haley sat at my dinner table with a man she'd been with for 5 months and felt something she couldn't name clearly yet, and instead of talking herself out of it, she reached for the one thing she trusted. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from knowing more. It comes from being honest about what you're feeling before your conscious mind has built a case for it. Haley had that. She'd had it since she was a kid. And what Cole was counting on, what every operator like him counts on, is that the people they've built a relationship with will override that intelligence with loyalty, with hope, with not wanting to be wrong about someone they care about. She didn't override it. That was the thing. I think about the woman in Nashville sometimes. 54 years old, 8 months invested in something she believed was real, $62,000 gone, too embarrassed to say anything because she'd trusted her own judgment, and her judgment had been manipulated so carefully that she couldn't separate what she'd actually felt from what she'd been made to feel. That's not weakness. That's what a skilled, patient, methodical person can do to someone who was open. The failure wasn't hers, but she had no one outside the situation to hand it to. Haley had me, and I had her, which meant I had something to protect that was worth moving fast for. The way I see it, Cole's actions had a logic to them that was always going to produce a consequence. He built something false and presented it as real. Not once, but repeatedly. Not to one person, but to at least 9 that we know of. Each repetition was a choice. Each choice narrowed what was eventually going to happen to him. Not because the universe has a ledger, but because patterns of behavior produce patterns of outcome. He kept doing it until he met someone whose father happened to know exactly what he was looking at. That's not luck. That's probability. You run the same scheme enough times, eventually the room contains someone who recognizes it. And Haley, for her part, made choices too. She paid attention to what she felt. She used what we had. She sat across from a man she trusted for 5 months and held herself together for 90 minutes so there would be something on record. That kind of courage doesn't come from not being afraid. It comes from deciding that what's on the other side of the fear is worth more than the comfort of avoiding it. She told me once, a few weeks after it was over, that she kept thinking about the pen he'd placed next to the documents. The way it was just sitting there, waiting. She said it felt like the whole thing had been decided already and she was just the last piece that needed to move. I told her, you moved. Just not the way he planned. That's what I want people to take from this. Not the fraud detection checklist, though that matters. Not the specific resources, though those matter too. The thing I want people to take is this. The moment your gut says something is off, that moment is not nothing. It is the beginning of something. What you do with it is entirely up to you. Haley did something with it, so did we.